Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome to another episode of electricairmobility.news on our YouTube channel. My name is Nicolas Zard, and today we're going to talk a little bit about the Paris Olympic Games, and I wrote a quick little primer on electricairmobility.news. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Nicolas Zard. I am also the founder of, never do it right, of Electric Air Mobility, a company, a consulting company that works with smart cities, municipalities, airports on determining or helping them understand what they need to do to design vertiports, networks of vertiports, so infrastructure, and of course, that means especially energy management, UTM, ATM, for those of you who understand what that means, and everything around eVTOLs and drones, coordinating both aspects of it and everything. So I've been around the electric mobility industries for about 20 years, 17 of which as a consultant and a journalist. And in 2014, about 10 years ago now, I switched over to what back then we called electric air mobility, what we now call advanced air mobility. So today's article is really a bit of a primer on what's going on with the Paris Olympic Games and the eVTOL routes, mostly Volocopter. On the article, I kind of left it as generic as possible, and I wanted to add a little bit more on the video because for two reasons. First of all, I'm half French, so I understand a little bit more about what's going on in France, and also because I've lived in Paris, so I can tell you a little bit more about the logistics. But let's recapture from everything. So Volocopter and so Groupe ADP, which is the airport groups around Paris, and the French Civil Aviation Authority, DGAC, with the Paris region, have finally agreed to 3 routes for Volocopter to operate this summer, as of this summer, for the Olympic Games. And these 3 routes should be fully operational by the end of this year, 2024. Now, it's really interesting what they consider to be viable routes, and I'll explain that a little bit like this. First of all, the first route is the main airport in Paris. It's the International Airport, Paris Charles de Gaulle, and it would link to the Paris Le Bourget Airport. Now, for those of you who have gone to the Paris Air Show, Le Bourget is that airport. But it's not an airport that's commonly used. I don't even know if it has commercial service. The other one is Orly, which is in the south of France. So connecting these 2 airports is intriguing for 2 reasons. First of all, like I said, it's not really an airport that's heavily used, and it's an airport that's it's pretty close to downtown, but it's also in a part of the city that I would not consider very touristy at all. Having said this, it does host an amazing aviation museum. If you can go there, go and check it out. It's got some fantastic early 1950s, 60s prototypes of airplanes, and I would highly recommend seeing it. But again, in the grand scheme of things, I probably wouldn't have chosen that airport specifically for the Paris Olympic Games. However, on an infrastructure side of things, yes, I totally get it. It's an airport. There's enough room for vertiports, and of course there's enough room to do all the energy solutions that we need for a vertiport, mainly hydrogen and electricity along sustainable aviation fuels. Now the other one is also intriguing because it makes sense strategically to have a vertiport on the Seine in Austerlitz, which is roughly in the middle of the city on the River Seine. It's a floating barge, so which is very interesting again because it's going to be interesting landing an eVTOL on that river, despite the river being very calm, right? There's no waves, no nothing, but, wind, shears, a lot of things could happen. But that barge will link to the Paris heliport, and this is also another point of concern because, as many people have pointed out, the Paris heliport is not a highly touristic place, let alone for commuters, right? So yes, some tourists will go to Paris and will go on a helicopter flight around Paris. That's very much understandable. But just like the first route, which is the Paris Charles de Gaulle route to Le Bourget, the Austerlitz Austerlitz barge to the Paris heliport, neither of them are very commuter centric, right? Unless you live in that part of the city, but chances are it's easier to take a bus. The metro is not really well done either because you have to go back down to the city and then go right back up to the airport. And most of us know that when we travel to the Le Bourget, to the Paris Air Show. And then lastly, the last one is very interesting because it links two extremely famous destinations, or at least one destination. And that one is the Paris heliport, again, to the airfield in Saint-Cyr-l'École, which is a place not too far away from the Château de Versailles. This is interesting because there is an airfield there, and it will need a commuter access to go to the Château de Versailles. So you can easily fly in from Paris to go see the Château de Versailles using a Volocopter. But remember, Volocopter only has one passenger and one pilot. So it's going to be very interesting to see how they work all of that up. And having lived there, albeit a few decades ago, but I still understand how it works, and I've been back for a while. It's very intriguing to see how they will make sense of all of this. First of all, on a financial level, also how many people do go travel to the Paris heliport, and I'm sure Groupe ADP has lots of plans to modernize the Paris heliport into something a little bit more bigger. And I think, if I remember well, they want to convert that to become a vertiport, which you have to go back and read my last two articles, both in French and in English, on not all heliports can be converted to vertiports. And I gave a few reasons, mostly location, but mostly the space included to have charging stations, battery storage solutions, hydrogen storage, etc., so on and so forth. So these vertiports, all three vertiports, the Paris Charles de Gaulle, Le Bourget, the Austerlitz to Paris heliport, and Paris heliport to Versailles, should be operational by September 2024 and fully operational before the end of the year for commuters and tourists. So it's a very interesting concept, and the Volocopter aircraft that they will be using is, like I said, the Volocity, which is really one pilot and one passenger. So it's very limited in terms of capacity, but hey, it's the first generation. I would love to see the SkyDrive SD05, for instance, because that's two passengers and one pilot. But I'm sure Volocopter is working on a bigger version of this. Hint, hint, nudge, nudge. The whole idea, and this is what Groupe ADP has told me last time when I talked to them, actually a year ago, a little over a year ago at the Paris Air Show, was to really develop a whole network of vertiports around Paris. And I kind of remember because I asked them, and they said, yeah, there's about 17 vertiports. And they said, oh, we don't need any help or anything like that. I said, are you serious? After 3 vertiports, you're not going to need any more help? And I pressed and I pressed them, and they said, well, yes, obviously we will need some help at that point. And that's when I gave them my card and I said, please, let's talk then, because you will need help and it'll be fantastic to work with you. This also marks a very first, and that means a very first city to offer urban air mobility, or UAM, globally. Yes, some cities have started to offer this to a certain point, but they're more on a demonstration basis. So this would be the first operational vertiport system on this planet. Again, those 3 spots are very interesting in and of themselves. They make a lot of sense on the infrastructure side of things. I find they might not make a lot of sense on the commuter sense of things, and it's questionable for the Paris heliport on the tourist side of things. So it will be interesting to see how it goes. And I do list a few other things that you should be reading to understand what else Volocopter has been doing and everything. Again, so there you go. So the very last thing I'll add to this is there was a lot of problems around this whole flying for Volocopter and offer a UAM routes around Paris. And there are many reasons for that. So being half French, I can understand the way that French people think, and I also understand how Paris works and everything. And it's pretty complicated, but if you think of France, really everything happens in Paris. Everything is centralized in Paris. Everything happens first in Paris, and then the provinces later on get something else, or the states get everything else later on. So everything pretty much happens in pairs. In the beginning, more or less people were kind of okay with the idea of it, but as the idea materialized or became a little bit more concrete, then there was a lot of backlash. There was a lot of pushback. Nobody wanted to see anything new flying above their heads. Very much like in New York, helicopters are loud, yada yada yada. Well, in this case, eVTOLs are not as loud as helicopters. In fact, they're 10 to 20 decibels quieter than helicopters, and they also have a very different signature of the sound. The propagation of the sound is very different. Instead of being horizontal, it's vertical. So I can kind of understand that, and it's mostly when they take off, not when they're in flight, or much less when they're in flight. And I can vouch for that. I mean, I've seen Volocopter fly. I've seen the Joby S4 fly and the Archer Maker fly, and yeah, they're very quiet. There's no doubt about that. But the pushback was more, I think, along the same lines as what the FAA calls people see noise more than they actually hear it. And so there was a whole backlash against that. There was a whole pushback. And strangely enough, it also came from the mayor of Paris, Hidalgo, who really was really opposed to it for a long time. So there was a lot of back and forth, a lot of fighting. So it's interesting to see that it is going ahead, and one can only imagine what must have happened behind the scenes for something like that to happen. Nonetheless, we're extremely excited and want to congratulate Volocopter for finally doing this. As you might have seen, especially I'll try to point out some of the earlier articles that I wrote. Volocopter and Lilium, both German companies, have had a lot of problems, a really hard time making ends meet in Germany. And in fact, Lilium is not looking to France as a manufacturing center, and Volocopter has even said, hey, Germany, if you don't help us, we're going to have to sell to the highest bidder. There you go. It's sort of a primer of what's happening in the Paris Olympic Games. Also know one thing is that usually in August, Paris completely calms down. This is one of the best times to go to Paris. There are not a lot of people around, but most shops are closed too. One thing that was really of high contention was that originally the city of Paris said for the Olympic Games, the metro tickets would be half price. Well, it turned out not at all. In fact, quite the opposite. Prices went up. The SNCF, the National Railway System, said that they would also lower their prices. In fact, they've done exactly the opposite. So, knowing the French really, they can fire up, when something is not right, as we probably all know. And rightfully so. I think they're great. It's great that they do that. So they are very much against this system. They are very much against anything that changes. But when you promise them one thing and you deliver another, you're going to get a lot of riled up French people. So I'm very intrigued to see how all of this will pan out. Needless to say, it will pan out. It is a global first, the first capital in the world to offer commuter UAM services. So congratulations Paris, congratulations Volocopter, congratulations DGAC, and Groupe ADP, and everyone who have worked hard for this. We are certainly looking into what you're doing, and we'll keep a very close eye on everything. And for all of the other folks participating in the Paris Olympic Games, good luck.